Once the greenest city in the whole of Central Asia, with an urban history of more than 100 years, Bishkek was the center of life and trade for people from diverse backgrounds. The first streets and squares in the city were built in the late 19th century, followed by a mass urban development during the Soviet period in the 1960s and 1970s. Until the 1990s, most of the Kyrgyz population lived in the countryside, and there were a few of them in the cities. This equation, however, changed after the fall of the USSR. Bishkek saw an overwhelming influx of domestic migrants who fled rural poverty from other regions of the country into Bishkek. Bishkek was not ready to provide housing for the newcomers. The newcomers looked for survival options. Thus, they started to build their own houses in the outskirts of the city, which it gradually became known in Russian as Novostrойkas. And in the following years, the city saw a rapid increase in its population. By record, the population of Bishkek was 1 million in 2017, and it is predicted to rise to 3 million until 2050. With the rise of the population far beyond the means of the city, the city also saw other pressing problems. Chief among them is the smoke and air pollution. That according to last year, Bishkek had a record high in air pollution, and it was known as the most polluted city in the world. The problems of Bishkek do not stay there, however. This summer, despite Kyrgyzstan is a water-rich upstream country, many neighborhoods in Bishkek complain from lack of water. And at the same time, public transportation is not enough, and the number of personal cars are beyond the means and limits of the city. That causes both traffic congestion and pollution alike. There are three key principles in a just city: equity, democracy, and diversity. The principle of equity is concerned with the equal distribution of resources in a city for all the population of the city, regardless of their social and economic backgrounds. The policies, public investments, and regulations implemented by the city authorities should provide equitable outcomes for all the population of the city. The principle of democracy advocates for the participation of citizens in the planning and decision-making of the city. And the principle of diversity emphasizes on tolerance and peaceful coexistence among mixed population from diverse ethnic, social, economic, and gender backgrounds who choose to live together in one city. Taking the concept of the just city into the consideration, we would like to explore the problems of Bishkek and how it is possible to overcome them. Well, my guest is Phillippe Campeau. He is a resident scholar in Bishkek and an environmentalist. He specializes in Soviet history.
I think it's an interesting concept to apply the just city to what, in a sense, was a socialist, or at least a Soviet city. If you consider it as a city where that was at least meant to be built for the public good, right? For use value, if you want. Then I think when you start looking at a city like Frunze through this angle, you start seeing beyond sort of the gray cityscape that we associate with these Soviet cities, which is like endless boring units of multi-story buildings built in the 60s and 70s. Actually, I think what's interesting with Soviet cities in general, Frunze, which is the one I know more in particular, is this sort of constant tension between the discourse and the reality. So on paper, Frunze was a wonderful place, right? It's an extremely green place. It's a place that should have had all the facilities required within 15-minute walk was the official policy. It was a place where, you could get driven to your job, you had access to sports facility, you could never leave the shade of a tree when it was summer, and etc. Now, that's sort of the official side. The reality was that the municipality never had the resources to sort of follow up on these promises, if you want. But I think what makes it interesting is that at least there was this discourse that the city was for people, and that people were sort of entitled almost, maybe not to the good life, but to a decent life, let's put it that way. And that is something that makes a place like Frunze very different from, your average megalopolis in the West or something like this. Well, so as you might be aware, my focus, my specialty is on green spaces, and I know we'll go back to that in a second. I think that is one of the, let's say, well, not just positive, but very fondly remembered legacy of the Soviet period was the creation of a city that was comfortable. You speak to people who remember Frunze and like, I could cross the whole city without ever, getting in the sun, and that's something that I remember very positively. It's also something that is changing, but we'll get back to this. I think in a sense, there is the memory of a city that was just easy, right? You had your classical challenge of Soviet life, looking for products to buy, especially towards the 80s, having to navigate a certain bureaucracy through, contacts you may or may not have with other people. But in the end, it was a city that was rather simple, rather predictable. Public transportation was working. Once you managed to get an apartment, that was not necessarily easy, but once you had one, you were part of it. You were in the block with your colleagues. Your work was never too far. At least there would be transport organized to it, etc. So I think in a sense, what independent Kyrgyzstan inherited in Frunze/Bishkek, right, was a city that, for the size that it was, worked rather well. Where people had been housed in, if not the most beautiful, at least functioning accommodation. A lot of the problems that were associated with the creations of all these mikrorayoni, like the living quarters, had started to be addressed, at least in the 70s. Okay, while there initially was no shop and no sporting facilities, that had started to change. So in the 90s, it was not a city that you felt proud of because it has a monstrous Eiffel Tower in the middle of it, but it was a city where you could be, Almaty is bigger, but we have a nice sort of quality of life. It's, in a sense, this is not only something that we find in the urban setting, in the city of Frunze. It's throughout, let's say, what happened in the 90s and 2000s. It contributed to that sense of nostalgia, is the way I would put it, right? If you were lucky enough to live in Frunze, it was not for everyone, let's remember, like free movement was not allowed. But if you had lived in Frunze, then you remember these green spaces, you remember this easy to navigate city, this cultured city, especially if you were lucky enough to live in the center. There is a disparity even in the Soviet city. It's not like everyone is absolutely equal. If you're the cultural elite, you get better access to housing than others. But still, people remember that. And in a sense, that's what they use to not necessarily refuse, but to compare with the new everyday life that saw Bishkek double in size, right? The population literally doubled in we can argue numbers, but within 20 years. A city that stopped being maintained. Obviously, there just wasn't. If the Soviet period didn't have the funding to do what they said they would do, then the 90s had literally no funding, right? So urban infrastructure was deteriorating. You have a gradual, but in the end, very strong penetration by rather unplanned development. Things are popping up that people might disagree with, but it is happening. The city, doubles in population, expands in size also tremendously in areas that were not planned, or at least were not planned, with use value in mind, with the good life in mind, etc. So I think it provides a very strong image of what the city had been to criticize it quite often. Well, we can start with, and again, not unique to Frunze Bishkek, but massive rise in inequality. In inequality, you have, like I said, the city doubled. A lot of the people that came were from regions. Some came with money, some did not. A lot of the, let's say, areas that were built around what was Soviet Frunze were built sort of very quickly. Well, these famous Novostrojka, right? These new sort of neighborhoods that either people took over or where you buy someone to get permission to build, and it becomes sort of very tight housing of a certain lower quality without services, etc. Right? So the city expands in a different way and becomes very sort of you get a big chasm between those that live in the center, those that live in the Soviet sort of built housing, and those that come after. So that's clearly one. I mean, I've referred to it already 2-3 times. There's issues with evolving, or rather diminishing amount of green spaces. There's an important problem slightly linked to that, but not only, with air pollution. Two things that I'm going to bring. And the first one is, I guess, what we'd assume, right? We go from a controlled, I don't like saying necessarily socialist, I mean, we can argue, but like from a controlled status system that built Frunze with a certain plan that they were not always able to actually implement, but at least, and we go to something completely, totally the opposite, where development becomes unmanaged. There is still an official city plan. I think it's, don't quote me, 20 years out of date, something like this. The development happens by link and who has money and that sort of stuff. So that's it's not just capitalism. It's wild capitalism in a sense, right? But that is also a link, and I think this puts a twist on it. For a start, I mentioned that Bishkek doubled in size, right? And as sort of the capital of a newly independent country, it also plays a role of absorbing, people that were in the countryside that couldn't move in the Soviet period, but that suddenly becomes jobless in a world where it's very difficult to stay in these areas. So if you can't move to Russia to work, you move to Bishkek, right? And in a sense, this inequality is also sort of the result of integrating a lot of people over a rather short period of time. And I would also say it's easy to sort of look at outside and sort of the elitist type of apartment that have mushroomed around central Bishkek, but there is also the fact that in Bishkek, unlike I think all the other capitals of Central Asia, if you're a migrant and you worked in Russia and you come back, well, you're able to fund, let's say, popularly driven development, not in the center, that allows you to eventually buy your own flat, right? If you were in Tajikistan, you would still be living in the family unit because development is controlled by a very tight circle of elites, etc. So there's a certain energy to this inequality in Bishkek that I think is quite unique. It's a problem that is not new. And that's something that was quite interesting when I researched green spaces in the Soviet period. You have citizens complaining about industrial air pollution because of Bishkek's geographical location. It's a bit of a ball, right? Wind doesn't blow things away that often. And so in a sense, it's the collapse and the deindustrialization of the 90s that reminded people what rather clean air felt like in Bishkek. And that has changed now with, I mean, the big culprits of, coal heating in winter, especially for these newly built districts. A quantity of cars that certainly did not exist in the Soviet period. okay, potentially a central heating station that hasn't had a filter for quite a few years, although that doesn't seem to be a key problem. It's quite a complex sort of mix of issues that bring this. But what I'm saying is that they're not new in a sense. And actually, from late Emil Shukurov's short interview that I conducted with him, the Soviet Frunze in the 80s actually had plans to sort of double the quantity of green spaces. Because of that, they were aware of the situation with air pollution. If we bring it back to this concept of a just city, I think there's two types of green spaces, both of which have been shrinking, right? Soviet Frunze was very committed to its public face as a green city. So it was sort of, the city had its own sort of greening department that still exists, but is massively underfunded. You build a new street, you build a new district, you put trees in it, right? But then also you have, even in the Soviet period, a lot of the accommodation in Bishkek is actually houses, right? And what you were allowed to do, and the popularity of things like gardening that allowed you to, increase your income/standard of living by growing a few things, etc. Now that has totally changed, and it's changed for two reasons. The official sort of greening along the streets and etc. By and large has been victim of both development. I mean, it's no surprise, right? Botanical gardens have been sort of eaten from both sides because it's so lucrative to build new housing on this, and if you had the right contacts, you can do it. We'd like to believe that this finished in the 90s, but it did not. Same in the biggest park of Bishkek, Kagacheva Rosha, in the north, has been, eaten from all sides. So there's that. There's a vision of modernity that, for many, gives more value to brand new large streets than to tree-lined ones that existed before. So like the reconstruction of streets around Bishkek has resulted in a lot of loss of these green spaces. But finally, there's also, these private neighborhoods. A lot of what were massive gardens with a tiny house have changed into, a monster two-story house with literally no gardens. So, they've been attacked from both sides, these poor green spaces. What I find very interesting, despite this, right, and despite the fact that, individually people will probably make the choice of building up the whole plot that they have and forget the 3-4 fruit trees that were there, this image of a green city sort of remains, and you see a lot of both nostalgia, but also actual fighting for it. And maybe another thing to add when we're discussing sort of these green spaces, and it's something that the pandemic really put in evidence, and to me that's sort of, it brings home the idea, the need for a just city in a sense. So massive lockdown, I'm not surprising anyone, 2 months at home, and if you're lucky to live in, let's say, the Soviet parts of Bishkek, you have a place to go for a jog, the parks are rather sizable, you can go outside, etc. Now, in these sort of newly built areas around Bishkek that we've discussed, quite often they've been built, the more plots you can sell, the more money you can make. There's very little public spaces in them, and there was just nowhere to go. And you have, families that literally, the only space that they had to exit their house during pandemic, was walking down, up and down a street that, has not a single tree on it, and that's it. And no green spaces. What was the limit that you were allowed to walk? A kilometer and a half? I mean, I forgot. Nothing for 3, 4, 5 kilometers. And I think that lack of public space is a clear sort of syndrome of what this unplanned development has done to the city. There's I'm going to reply to this through a bit of a story. it's a while ago now, probably 5 years. There was a conference, Bishkek City of the Future, I think it was named. And it brought together sort of activists and scholars, and I think the vice-mayor back then was present. And on the one hand, you had activists, mentioning this collapsing green spaces, this new phase, this sort of wild urbanization, this desire for some of the positive side of the Soviet sort of urbanity that we've discussed. And the answer of the mayor was fascinating to me, because he basically ignored this. There was not a word said about all these issues. But what he hammered over and over was that as a city, we're connecting these new neighborhoods, these Novostroyki, right? We're bringing them water, bringing them electricity, we're integrating them. And that's what we're doing. So basically shut up about all these little issues. We're focusing on the main thing, which is, integrating everyone around Bishkek and avoiding the development of sort of secluded, Novostroyki. And that's very interesting. On the one hand, of course, that means, building works. So I'm not too surprised that was part of the official agenda. But on the other, it's always easy, especially in a place like Bishkek, to sort of hammer the authorities for not doing a lot. And there are certainly issues. But there's also, there's a series of issues, and some of them have been addressed rather successfully. I mean, Novostroyki have been integrated into Bishkek to a large extent. I'm not saying it's perfect. So, yes. In terms of regulation, I mean, we've mentioned the city plan, non-existent, etc. Like the problems are there, and there's plenty of them. But, things are not static, and some issues are not discussed that much anymore because, in a sense, they're being resolved. Again, I always like to compare Bishkek to, let's say, a Tashkent or an Almaty or a Dushanbe, right? Capitals capitals or biggest city of neighboring countries, where urban activism can be either much more controlled or actually much more dangerous, depending on the situation, right? What's fascinating with a city like Bishkek is that it's not only possible, it is used, and it sometimes works, obviously sometimes doesn't. And I'll give you an example. There's plenty of examples of, this sort of wild capitalistic development in Bishkek, right? Someone comes into a dvor, these sort of courtyards between multi-story buildings, and decides, we're building one more here, or we're building a cafe here. And you'll find plenty of cafes in dvor, so it has happened. But you also find plenty of them without, and quite a lot of time it's local residents getting together and basically opposing these development plans, sometimes with success, sometimes without. And that's something you just wouldn't see outside of Kyrgyzstan, I think, anyway. You have had successful groups defending the destruction of murals, to build a new cafe or something like this. There's ongoing fight about this restaurant in like Oak Park, Dubovay Park in the center. So I think urban activism exists. Initiatives like Pishkom, developing ways of walking the cities rather than driving, potentially to compensate this air pollution crisis we're discussing. Are they always successful? Is it easy to change the mind, to get the government to act differently? I'm not saying it is, but what I'm saying is we're seeing some real politics happening on the ground, and it's not something that at least I've found in a lot of other cities in the region. I think it's easy to see the explosion of private cars, and that is definitely the case, right? I don't have the stats in my head, but numbers have exploded. There's a really cool analysis by another historian of the Soviet period, Sigelbaum, who looks at car usage in the Soviet period, and it was growing. And of course, it's impossible to know what would have happened, if the Soviet Union had continued, but what we're seeing, in a sense, is people getting access to mass car usage in a way that they had started to in the Soviet period, but that had never been that easy. Right now, buying a car is something that you can do, without requiring contacts or a monstrous salary. Let's put it that way. So in a sense, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's in a sense, it's a natural process, and one that we've seen in cities throughout the world. Now, it's not desirable, but it's not unexpected. I think the issue with public transportation has more to do with sort of structure that have appeared during the 90s, right? As I said, public transportation in Soviet Frunze, they were never perfect, but they were good in general. And I think what appears in the 90s is like stuff like the marshrutka, right? These minibus plying the streets. They became more reliable. They became less likely to break down. They take less people. They're a bit quicker than what existed. And they created lobbies. And I think there are now tensions between, aging public transportation infrastructure, a new one that is or isn't being used, depending on interest in the city, etc. So I probably can't address the question of safety on public transportation, but definitely the fact that in a society that comes out from this sort of stated socialism or whatever, having access to a car seems both desirable and is also quite often a way of earning a living, right? What I think is happening now, in a sense, is a bit of a process of stabilization, if I can say that. You had a city that worked up to the 80s, let's say, and then you have this very unique period in the 90s, which, a total readaptation to a different way of doing things, the arrival of private capital in a way that neither the authorities nor the people living here really knew how to deal with, and I think that is slowly changing. As I said, all these novostrelki that were built either by people themselves, either through connections with let's say elites, they're being integrated into the city. We're seeing a city that is becoming legible again. I'm not saying that it's becoming fairer. That remains to be decided. But I think its period of chaos, at least, I would imagine to be coming to an end. And I think it's at an interesting point for that reason. There is energy in Bishkek, right? We've discussed a little bit about activism. There are politicians, or at least bureaucrats, for lack of a better word, that are trying to make things move. And I think if, let's say, if these two can get in touch enough so that the new structure, like this new normalization, is done maybe with more emphasis on public goods, aka recreating paths in those newly built area where there is none. Looking back at issues of air pollution, and they're real ones, they're mobilizing issues. You only have to spend a winter in Bishkek to realize that. Could potentially put a bit of a break on this sort of mad development that Bishkek, I would say, has suffered from in the last 30 years.